There are wounds that let a person keep breathing, but only as a shell of who they used to be. Not a physical death, but a quiet crumbling from within. The place where hope once lived now replaced by an unbearable emptiness. Loss is something everyone faces in life, but some losses strike too suddenly, too cruelly, leaving the survivor unable to make sense of what happened, let alone find a way to heal. There are tragedies so deep that even words fall short. They defy logic, they mock justice, and they leave those who are left behind with questions no one can answer. Why me? Why did the people I love have to leave like this? And how? How can I possibly forgive when the one who caused it all is still alive, still breathing, still walking around as if nothing ever happened? We grow up being told that forgiveness is the noble path, the right thing to do, the key to inner peace. But what no one tells us is that true forgiveness is never easy, especially when what we're being asked to forgive isn't a small mistake, a hurtful word, or a misunderstanding in anger, but something that broke us to the core, something so painful that even time cannot stitch it back together. Forgiveness in the face of tragedy is not a moral choice. It's not something you can be talked into with kind advice or spiritual quotes. Forgiveness, when tied to unbearable pain, is a long and solitary journey, a path where you must face the darkest parts of yourself, peel back layers of anger, sorrow, and buried memories, just to reach something that still feels human inside. Some people have lost their entire families in a single moment. Some were betrayed by those they trusted most. Some have seen horrors that haunt them for the rest of their lives. And these people, if they choose a life of hatred, no one could blame them. They have every reason to be angry, to demand justice, to live with bitterness until their final breath. But there are also people, somehow, who choose the opposite, who choose to forgive, not to forget, not to excuse, but simply to live, to survive with an open heart, even after it's been shattered. Their journey is not a miracle. It is real. It is written in tears, in silence, in meditation halls, in slow, mindful breaths, and in each trembling step along the path that Buddhism calls the path of liberation. Forgiveness doesn't arrive like magic. It grows through practice, through turning inward, through understanding suffering, and finally, letting go of what we've carried for far too long. This video is a collection of such stories, true or close to true, of those who have fallen into the deepest valleys of human pain, and who, somehow, found a way up again through forgiveness. Each story is a slice of life, a wound that once bled, but also a testimony that the human heart, even after being broken, can still return to love when nourished with compassion and wisdom. If you carry a wound inside you that you've never been able to put into words, if you've lost someone, been betrayed, wronged, or gone through something so unfair that it made you shut down, if you feel like you can never forgive, and yet can't find peace without it, then maybe these stories will reach you. Not to preach, not to push you to change, but simply to remind you that you are not alone, and that there is a path forward, even from the darkest place you've ever been. How I Found Peace After Unthinkable Tragedy, a Buddhist journey to forgiveness. In every human life, there are moments so devastating that everything we once believed in, justice, love, even the goodness of people, shatters. These are not ordinary losses, but tragedies that make us question the very meaning of existence. And in the silence that follows, one quiet question begins to echo. Is forgiveness even possible? This video doesn't aim to explain or preach. Instead, it invites you into a series of stories, true, or very close to true, about people who stood at the edge of hatred and somehow chose a different path, the path of forgiveness, liberation, and deep compassion, inspired by the spirit of Buddhism. Part 1. When Tragedy Strikes, a Life Shattered. There are moments when life feels like a mirror hurled onto cold stone, shattered beyond repair. Nothing is left intact. No one can save what's been lost. Pain crashes down without warning, like a tidal wave that drowns everything. The people we love, the familiar things we cling to, and even the version of ourselves we once knew. When someone takes away your family, when a child is lost forever because of another's reckless moment, when war or hatred sweeps through and leaves only silence, we ask ourselves, how do you forgive that? And perhaps more truthfully, should we forgive it all? Forgiveness sounds like a beautiful idea printed in books. But when you're in the pit of grief, when your heart has been ripped apart by loss, forgiveness can feel like the most impossible thing in the world. This first part of the journey brings us to stories that seem utterly unforgivable, where pain speaks, and people come face to face with the darkest corners of their being. Story 1. The mother who lost her son in a school shooting. A journey toward the light. The house on Cedar Street, number 27, used to echo with laughter. Mornings were a whirlwind of breakfast chaos, and the fridge was plastered with crayon drawings and math awards. Now it was all memories. Emily never thought she would become the mother who lost her child in a school shooting. That phrase used to belong on the news, happening far away, to someone else. But that morning, as she was pouring coffee, her phone buzzed. There's been a shooting at the school. Students are being evacuated. She remembers driving like a maniac, her heart pounding. The sirens, the chaos, the sea of panicked parents. And then, the young police officer who couldn't look her in the eye. We're so sorry. Your son, Aaron, didn't make it. The world stopped. The days after were a blur. Visitors, flowers, news vans, condolences, all faded into smoke. Emily couldn't even cry. She was stone, clinging to the memories of her son like oxygen. Aaron was only 9. He loved math, adored Lego, and hummed quietly when brushing his teeth. And just like that, he was gone, stolen by a teenager with a gun and a storm in his mind. The shooter was just 17. A former student with a troubled past, diagnosed too late, ignored too long. Aaron was collateral in a broken system. Nothing about it made sense. And in her heart, a wildfire began to grow. Why is that boy still breathing? Why is my son dead? I want him to feel every ounce of the pain he caused. She had nightmares. Aaron would appear, but say nothing, walking away into a blinding light. She screamed his name, but he never turned back. She always woke up with her chest burning and eyes dry. One afternoon, digging through Aaron's old school box. For the first time in weeks, Emily cried. Not from rage, but from the first crack in the heavy stone that had sealed her heart. She began to sit in silence. At first, just 5 minutes a day. Then came podcasts, more books, and eventually, a local Buddhist meditation group that met at a small temple outside town. There, in the stillness of those sacred mornings, Emily finally let herself sit with the pain, not fighting it, not blaming, but observing. She imagined Aaron, not as a victim, but as a soul continuing its journey beyond this life. She asked herself, if my son still exists in the great expanse of this universe, would he want me to stay stuck in this endless rage? The answer came like a breeze. No, Mom. Light a candle. Don't feed the fire. Forgiveness didn't come overnight. But with every breath on the cushion, every tear shed without anger, something inside her softened. She began writing letters, not to send, but to the boy who took Aaron's life. Not to excuse, not to reconcile, but to lay down the weight that had started to burn her from within. At a memorial service, Emily stood at the microphone and said, I used to wish pain upon the one who hurt us. But now I understand. I was letting their hate become my own. Today, I choose to forgive, not because they deserve peace, but because I do. Some in the crowd were stunned. Some wept. But in Emily's eyes that day, there was no confusion. Palden Gyatso, compassion in the heart of hell. Palden Gyatso was born in a small Tibetan village in 1933. At the age of 18, he became a Buddhist monk, dedicating his life to a simple existence within the monastery. When the Chinese army invaded Tibet in 1950, he continued his practice, devoting his days to awakening and compassion. But life took a harrowing turn. In 1959, after the Tibetan uprising, Palden was arrested. The charge, counter-revolutionary activity. No trial, no defense. He was sentenced to prison. And so began 33 years of hell. During those 3 decades, Palden wasn't simply imprisoned. He was brutally tortured, beaten with iron rods, burned with fire, had his teeth knocked out, starved for days. At one point, he was hung upside down by metal wires, simply for refusing to defame the Dalai Lama. Not once, not for a year, but for 33 years. Who could survive such inhumanity and still keep their heart from turning to stone? And yet, what made Palden extraordinary was not just his endurance. It was the compassion he maintained. Even in his darkest hours, In his memoir, Palden wrote, "I witnessed things no human should ever witness. I felt pain beyond description. But the deepest suffering was not the wounds on my body, but watching my captors lose the love in their hearts." One day, shackled and alone in solitary confinement, he began to meditate. Not to escape, not to forget, but to contemplate the suffering of those who were torturing him. If I give in to hatred, I become no different from them. If I keep my compassion, I remain human. He began practicing Tonglen, a Tibetan meditation where one breathes in the suffering of others and breathes out love. Breathing in darkness, breathing out light. He had no incense, no scriptures, no prayer beads, but he had his breath. And from that breath, he rebuilt an entire temple within. In 1992, after international pressure, Palden was released. He emerged from prison frail and weak, but his spirit radiant. Many expected him to be angry, to scream for revenge, to condemn those who tortured him. But he didn't. When he stood before the United Nations to share his testimony, he brought a box of torture instruments, the very tools once used against him. But he didn't hold them up to ignite hate. What we need is not more hatred, but more compassion. Forgiveness, in Palden's case, wasn't forgetting the truth. It wasn't denying the pain. It was choosing not to let that pain create more darkness. He did not forget what happened, but he refused to let it define the rest of his life. Palden Gyatso spent his remaining years spreading truth, compassion, and nonviolence around the world. He passed away in 2018 at the age of 85. Even at the end, he wore a soft smile, the kind of smile only someone who had walked through hell and returned with light could wear. Story 3. The Ukrainian girl who lost her family in war but saved a Russian soldier. Maria lived in a small village near Kharkiv. She was the youngest in a family of 4, her parents and an older brother. Life was simple, peaceful, mornings filled with sunlight and the smell of fresh bread. But then the war came, like a shadow swallowing everything whole. One March evening, a shell hit their home. Her parents were killed instantly. Her brother, a volunteer soldier, went missing in a battle nearby. Maria, only 22 at the time, survived, but her heart did not. Everything she loved disappeared in a matter of days. She wandered away from the rubble, carrying nothing but a small backpack in her bare hands. In her mind, only one question echoed: why? Hatred was her first instinct. Every time she thought about the people who killed her parents, she wanted to scream, to take revenge. There was a fire inside her, not the fire of life, but of silent rage. But one afternoon, while fleeing through a forest with a group of refugees, Maria saw a soldier lying in the mud, wounded and groaning in pain. He wore a Russian uniform. The others wanted to leave him. Some even suggested finishing him off. He was the enemy, after all. Maria stood there, locking eyes with him. He looked barely older than she was, a boy, really. He reached out a trembling hand, trying to speak through bloodied lips. And in that moment, something broke inside Maria, not her hatred, but her fear. A deep fear that if she let him die, she would also lose the last piece of her humanity. She stepped forward, kneeling, lifting his head gently. She found water, tore cloth to stop the bleeding, and begged the others to help. They stared in disbelief. Someone called her crazy, but Maria whispered, "If I let him die, then the war has already won." They brought him to an abandoned monastery, where a few nuns had stayed behind to care for the wounded, regardless of who they were. Maria stayed for a week to help. She didn't speak much. The soldier, Alexei, didn't ask questions. Each carried their own pain. Until one day, when Alexei was well enough to speak clearly, he wept. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. They sent me to fight, and I followed orders. But I never imagined that someone I hurt could be the one to save me." Maria didn't reply, but something softened in her chest. When the first snow fell, Maria sat outside in silence, meditating, breathing, eyes closed. An elderly nun approached and asked, "Child, what are you searching for?" Maria whispered, "I'm not sure. Maybe peace." The nun smiled. Forgiveness is not a gift for others. It is the first gift you give yourself. A month later, Maria left the monastery. Alexei was transferred to Poland to recover. They didn't promise to stay in touch, but in their eyes, something had changed. Life, fragile but real, could still bloom in the ashes. Maria would never forget her parents or her brother. The pain remained. But now, she was no longer a prisoner of hatred. The war had taken her family, but she would not let it take her heart. Story 4. The Rwandan man, lost his family in genocide, still chose to forgive. Based on true events. Fictionalized through a Buddhist lens for emotional and spiritual depth. His name was Jean-Paul. Before 1994, he was a simple carpenter living in rural Rwanda with his wife and 3 young children. Each morning, the laughter of his kids woke him. Life was not rich, but it was full of love. And then, one day, the sun didn't rise. In April of that year, the nightmare known as the Rwandan genocide erupted. In just 100 days, nearly 1 million Tutsi were killed, butchered with machetes, burned alive, hunted by their neighbors. Jean-Paul's family didn't survive. He was taken for forced labor while a local militia stormed his home. His wife and children were killed at the front gate. When he returned days later, clutching the necklace of his youngest daughter, the only thing left behind. Years later, someone asked him, "How did you not lose your mind?" Jean-Paul answered in a voice soft as wind, "I died the day they killed my family. But I refused to die again by holding onto hatred." He chose not to flee Rwanda after the war. He stayed, not for vengeance, but to learn how to forgive. He visited monks, meditated in silence, and later began sitting each morning under a large mango tree behind his house, the same tree where he once told bedtime stories to his daughter. Forgiveness did not come easily. There were days when, closing his eyes, he still heard the screams and the laughter of killers. But in the silence, something else began to arise, something war could not destroy: love. He realized that hatred would not bring his family back, but hatred could kill him a second time, from the inside out. And so, from that insight, Jean-Paul began to change, not by forgetting, but by transforming. 10 years later, something no one expected happened. Jean-Paul was invited to testify in a local tribunal, a trial for one of the men who had helped murder his family. The man's name was Emmanuel. Once, they had shared tea together as neighbors. In court, Emmanuel sat trembling, head bowed in shame. Jean-Paul walked up. No anger, no raised voice. He looked directly at Emmanuel for a long time, and then spoke. "I will never understand what you did, but I no longer wish to carry hatred in my heart. I forgive you." The room froze in stunned silence. Tears fell from nearly every eye. Even Emmanuel collapsed in sobs, falling to his knees. Jean-Paul became a symbol of reconciliation. He never wrote a book. He never toured the world giving speeches. But his story traveled, from that small village to Buddhist conferences, to the halls of the United Nations, and into the hearts of people who once believed forgiveness was impossible. When asked where he learned such forgiveness, he simply smiled. From the place that hurt the most. Because if the heart cannot open in darkness, then what meaning does the light have? Jean-Paul never remarried. But in his backyard, he planted 3 mango trees, one for each child. And each morning, he would sit beneath them, close his eyes, and smile. Not because he forgot, but because he let go. Part 2. Hatred, the prison of the mind. Someone once said, "Forgiveness isn't setting the other person free. It's setting yourself free." But when pain is still raw, hatred is a prison without a lock, yet we stay trapped inside it for years, sometimes a lifetime. Each thought of revenge becomes a new chain. Each painful memory, a brick in the wall. And in the end, the one who remains imprisoned is not the enemy. It is us. This part will guide us through stories where hatred seemed justified, until those involved discovered a deeper truth. Forgiveness is not surrender, it is liberation. Story 1. The father who swore revenge, until he saw that his son carried the same hatred. In a quiet town in southern France, there lived a man named Etienne. 10 years ago, his wife had been murdered during a home invasion. The killer was a 17-year-old boy, no prior criminal record. Just desperation that spiraled into tragedy. He was arrested and sentenced, but as a minor, he only served 8 years. Etienne, once a gentle baker, became a shadow of who he was. Withdrawn, silent, and above all, burning with quiet rage. Every night, he stared at his wife's photo and whispered to himself, "One day, I'll make him pay." But he didn't kill, didn't act. Now in his 50s, was no longer alone. He had a 14-year-old son named Luke, whom he'd adopted from an orphanage several years after his wife's death. Luke was a quiet, thoughtful child. That hatred was a form of strength. That revenge was a kind of justice. One day, Luke got into a fight at school. Nothing too serious, but enough to leave bruises, and something worse. The fury he thought he'd contained, the pain he believed was private, it had seeped into Luke's heart, unnoticed. That night, Etienne didn't sleep. He sat by Luke's bedside, watching his son breathe softly in the dark. And for the first time, he saw the full weight of what he had passed down, not just his love, but his suffering. The next morning, Etienne did something no one expected. He went to meet the man who had killed his wife, now a quiet janitor at a small church in the outskirts of town. Etienne brought no weapon, no anger. Only one thing to say: I hated you for 10 years. But today I choose to stop. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I don't want my son to grow up like me. The man fell to his knees, weeping. He couldn't speak. And Etienne, for the first time in a decade, walked away with a lighter heart. Not because he had forgotten the pain, but because he finally understood. Hatred does not lessen suffering, it multiplies it. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is freedom. Story 2. Meditating with Prisoners, and a Lesson in Forgiveness. Ajahn Brahm, a renowned Australian Buddhist monk, once shared a story that stayed with him for life. One day, he was invited to teach a meditation class inside a maximum security prison. Many of the men there were convicted of serious crimes, murder, drug trafficking, even killing their own family members. And yet, that day, they sat on simple plastic chairs, legs crossed, eyes closed, learning how to follow the breath. The silence was almost surreal. Outside were towering walls and razor wire. Inside were men who had walked through the darkest acts, now trying to listen to something softer. After the first session, a heavily tattooed man, strong and stern, approached Ajahn Brahm. His eyes carried the weight of years. Venerable, I can't forgive myself. Ajahn smiled. That kind of smile that is both compassionate and quietly playful. Did you ever draw an ugly picture when you were a kid? The man frowned, confused, then slowly nodded. Did you hate that child who drew it? There was silence. But in that moment, Ajahn saw it, something breaking open. He continued, the past is just a bad drawing. You don't have to hang it on the wall forever. You can draw a new one, a better one. Starting today. That sentence cracked something deeper than any prison wall. From that day, meditation sessions in that prison became more than just breathing exercises. They became a place where men burdened with guilt, rage, and pain began to forgive. One man, tears welling up, once shared, I never forgave my father. He beat me all through my childhood. But now, I see he was just a man wounded too, and no one ever taught him how to heal. Ajahn Brahm never lectured in lofty doctrines. He told stories. He laughed. And somehow, he made men who thought they were beyond redemption smile again. And inside those walls of steel and cement, perhaps no prison had ever felt so free. Because when the heart lets go of hatred, even prison becomes a meditation hall. Story 3. A letter of apology in the dark, an American prisoner transformed by the Dharma. In a maximum security prison in California, there lived a man named Derek Jamal Wright, a lifer convicted of first-degree murder. When he first entered prison, Derek was the embodiment of rage. He didn't just hate the world, he despised himself. He once told a fellow inmate, I deserve to be locked up. I killed someone, and a part of me died that day too. Derek's childhood had been a cycle of violence. His father was an alcoholic who regularly beat his mother and children. Derek grew up scarred, always in fight-or-flight mode. He joined a gang at 15. By 22, during a street retaliation, he pulled the trigger, and there was no going back. But something unexpected happened behind bars. While cleaning the prison library one afternoon, Derek randomly picked up a book titled Being Peace by Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. At first, it was just to pass the time. But each sentence began to seep into the cracks of his hardened soul. When we hold on to hatred, we poison ourselves. When we breathe in and recognize our pain, we begin to heal. Derek started practicing mindfulness. Each morning, he sat on his cold steel bed, inhaling, exhaling, gently observing each surge of anger, each painful memory. One day, during meditation, the face of the man he had killed appeared vividly before him. Derek broke down, not from fear, but because, for the first time, he saw the pain he had caused, to the victim, to the family, and to himself. He began writing a letter. He didn't know if it would be read, but he wrote anyway. The letter was addressed to the mother of the young man he had murdered. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I humbly bow in remorse. Every day I spend within these four walls, I think of you and your son with a heart full of sorrow. I am learning to be human again, even if it's late. 3 months later, the unimaginable happened. She wrote back. Her response: I've lived with hatred for 10 years. It ate me alive. But reading your letter, something cracked, a small beam of light. I can't forgive you yet, but for the first time, I want to try letting go. From that moment, Derek was no longer just another inmate. He became a meditation guide within the prison, sharing the Dharma with others, men who, like him, had been raised in violence, fed on anger, and lost in guilt. He's still incarcerated, but his soul is free. And the greatest miracle wasn't that someone forgave him. It was that he learned to forgive himself. Story 4. Forgiving oneself, the memory of a Vietnam War veteran. His name was Walter Griggs. Over 40 years had passed since he left the Vietnam battlefield, but for him, the war had never truly ended. It still smoldered in his mind, like a fire that refused to die. Walter lived alone in a small wooden cabin on the outskirts of Oregon. He had been divorced for years. His only son never spoke to him. Walter didn't blame him. He knew he had never been a good father. Walter had been a Marine, deployed to Vietnam in 1969. He never forgot the damp jungles, the roaring of artillery, and the eyes of the Vietnamese people, eyes filled with both fear and anger. One time, during a raid on a village suspected of harboring guerrillas, Walter gave the order to fire into a hut where they heard the cries of children. When he stepped in, he saw a mother clutching the lifeless bodies of her 2 young children. Living recklessly, he thought, I don't deserve to live. I'm a murderer. The world called him a veteran, but he called himself a criminal. One day, when he was over 60, Walter happened to pass by a small Buddhist temple near the edge of town. Something made him stop. Maybe it was the sound of the bell. Maybe the smell of incense. He walked in. Inside sat an elderly Vietnamese monk in meditation. The monk asked no questions. He simply said, the past cannot be changed, but the present is where karma can be transformed. Walter began visiting the temple every week. No one forced him to become a Buddhist, but every time he sat in meditation, he felt like he was allowed to sit with his pain without being judged. The monk taught him how to breathe, how to recognize emotions, how to say words of repentance, not to anyone else, but to himself. One day, after a long meditation, Walter broke down in tears and said, I killed people. I can't forgive myself. The monk replied, if you cannot forgive, then begin by facing the pain with compassion, not to justify, but to stop running. Years went by, but I ask you to let me live the rest of my life as a human being. Walter began writing letters to Vietnamese families, offering to visit and support those who had suffered in the war. No one told him to do it. But he said, I don't want to die a soldier. I want to die as someone who has learned how to love. He never heard anyone say, I forgive you. But simply by daring to face himself, by living with compassion, he opened the door he thought he'd be imprisoned behind forever. And in the silence of meditation, he found the answer. Forgiveness is not erasing wrongdoing. It is creating space for the light to enter. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. There's a quote often attributed to the Buddha, though its exact origin is uncertain. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Regardless of where it came from, it speaks a profound and unsettling truth. Because anger, in reality, hurts the one who carries it far more than the one it is directed at. When someone is deeply hurt, betrayed, deceived, suffering a terrible loss at the hands of another, hatred and resentment often arise as a natural reaction. It's like a fire that protects the wounded area from being touched again. But the dangerous thing is, the fire doesn't go out when the other person leaves. It continues to burn inside us, consuming our peace, our personality, and our vitality. Buddhism calls this the bondage of hatred, a tie that keeps us spinning endlessly in the cycle of samsara, playing roles where we are both the victim and the avenger. If not resolved in this life, it will repeat in the next. Hatred is a burden, not a weapon. We often think that holding on to anger is a way to not forgive evil, that if we let go, we're forgiving the unforgivable. But in Buddhism, it's seen differently. Forgiveness is not denying wrongdoing. It's stopping that wrongdoing from continuing to have power over our life. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha compares hatred to a burning coal we pick up with the intention of throwing it at someone else. But before we can throw it, it burns our own hand. Forgiveness is an act of wisdom, not weakness. In the eyes of the world, forgiveness is often seen as weakness. But in the Buddhist view, forgiveness is the highest sign of inner strength, the strength to see the truth of karma and not allow our mind to be dragged into the cycle of hatred. In many stories of monks being insulted or harmed, the Buddha didn't teach them to fight back, but to see the suffering behind the aggressor's actions and respond with compassion. Forgiveness is not about giving the other person peace. It's about reclaiming our own peace. The root of forgiveness, understanding suffering and karma. If someone has wronged you, caused pain, stolen happiness, or destroyed what you held dear, remember, they act out of ignorance and karma. They act from unhealed wounds, from delusion, from craving and aversion. Buddhism teaches that no one is born evil, but through suffering, misunderstanding, and blind habitual patterns, they commit harmful acts. If we respond with hatred, we are also watering the same seeds within ourselves. Peace doesn't come from revenge, it comes from letting go. History holds many examples of people who endured unimaginable tragedies, loss of loved ones, betrayal, imprisonment, torture, humiliation. And yet, instead of nourishing hatred, they chose to let go, not because they were weak, but because they chose liberation. That's why in Buddhist meditation, practitioners often cultivate metta, loving kindness, not only for loved ones, but even for those who have harmed them. Not because those people deserve it, but because we deserve peace. Hatred is a prison of our own making. Forgiveness is the key that sets us free, and only we can unlock the door. Part 3. Forgiveness, not for others, but for yourself. There's a common misconception that forgiveness is a gift we give to those who hurt us, that when we forgive, it's because they deserve it. But in the spirit of Buddhism, forgiveness is not about whether they deserve it, it's about whether we deserve peace. When we hold on to resentment, we shackle our own hearts. Every time we revisit the wound, it's like stabbing ourselves again. The person who caused the pain may be long gone, may have forgotten, but we remain imprisoned by a past we refuse to release. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't excuse the wrong. Forgiveness simply means we no longer allow the past to have power over our peace. And that is when true healing begins. Story 1. Immaculée Ilibagiza, surviving the Rwandan genocide, choosing forgiveness and spreading love. Based on a true story that has touched millions around the world. In 1994, Rwanda, a small country in Africa, descended into the darkness of one of the most horrific genocides in modern history. In just 100 days, nearly 1 million people of the Tutsi ethnic group were brutally murdered by extremist Hutus. It was not only the collapse of a nation, but also the shattering of humanity. Amidst that nightmare, a young woman named Immaculée Ilibagiza survived. And she didn't just live to tell the story, she lived to forgive. Something almost unimaginable in such a context. As the violence erupted, Immaculée's father, a gentle schoolteacher, told her to flee. He took her to a local pastor, a Hutu man who risked his life to hide her despite knowing it could mean death for him and his family. Immaculée, along with 7 other women, hid in a tiny bathroom barely 1 square meter in size for 91 days. They couldn't speak, couldn't move freely, saw no light, and dared not make a sound. Just fear, silence, and the faint rhythm of their breath. During those 3 months, death squads searched the house repeatedly. At times, they stood just outside the thin door, saying, "They must be here. I can smell the stench of Tutsis." With no way to escape, Immaculée turned inward. She began to pray, to meditate, to repeat mantras with desperation. At first, her heart burned with rage. She imagined killing those murderers with her bare hands. She wished for a weapon. She wanted revenge. But slowly, something began to shift. In the silence, a question arose. If I hold the same hatred they do, how am I any different? That question would become her salvation. When the genocide ended, she stepped out of that bathroom transformed. Her parents, 2 brothers, and close friends had all been killed. The boy next door, who used to play with her as a child, was the one who murdered her father. The world she once knew had collapsed. And yet, she made the decision to confront the man who took everything from her. That day, as she stood face to face with her family's killer, now a prisoner, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't curse him. She looked him in the eye and said, "I forgive you." She did not say it for him. She said it so her own heart could be free. Because she realized, hatred is a prison, and the first prisoner is always oneself. Later, Immaculee moved to the United States, wrote a memoir titled Left to Tell, and traveled the world sharing her story, not as a victim, but as a living example of compassion's power to transcend suffering. To forgive is not to forget. It is to stop letting the past control your heart. Her journey is not just Rwanda's wound. It is a wound of humanity. And her courage is an invitation to us all. If she, who lost almost everything, could forgive, then what is it we're still holding on to? Story 2. The mother who forgave the driver who killed her son. The accident happened so suddenly. One moment, 10-year-old Leo was laughing as he crossed the street on his way home from school. The next moment, a loud screeching of brakes, a scream, and then silence. Just like that, his mother, Maria Thompson, lost her only son on a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles. The driver was a 19-year-old boy named Tyler Reed. He had just gotten his license, was checking his phone for directions, and didn't see the red light in time. The collision threw Leo several meters forward. The ambulance arrived quickly, but it was too late. Leo died at the scene. Maria's world collapsed. Her heart shattered into pieces, and her mind could not comprehend the void that had just been torn into her life. The next days blurred into each other. Police reports, a sea of flowers at the door, and an unbearable silence that screamed through every corner of her home. She hated Tyler, hated his carelessness, hated the way the world kept turning when her son was gone. When she saw him in court for the first time, shaking, crying, unable to look up, she felt the flames of rage burning inside her. How could he cry when her child was in a coffin? But time passed. Maria couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Even the act of breathing felt heavy. Yet amid that storm of grief, something unexpected began to rise. Exhaustion, not just of the pain, but of the hatred itself. Hatred was consuming her, turning her into a shadow of herself. And slowly, a question began to whisper in her heart. What would Leo want me to become? Leo had always been a kind, gentle boy. He once gave his lunch to a homeless man and said, "He's someone's son too." Maria remembered that clearly. And now, she found herself standing in front of her meditation altar, lighting a candle for the first time in months. She began to practice mindfulness, not because she believed it would fix everything, but because she was drowning and needed to float. At first, it was 5 minutes of breathing, then reading short Buddhist verses, then sitting for longer and watching the storms inside her calm down. Just a little. One evening, while meditating, Maria saw Leo in her mind, not as the body in the hospital, but as the smiling boy he had always been. She imagined him hugging her, saying, "Let me go. Mama, I'm okay." That night, for the first time, Maria wept not from pain, but from release. Weeks later, she asked to meet Tyler. Everyone around her protested. "He killed your son," they said. But Maria shook her head. "He made a terrible mistake. But if I hold on to this hate, I'll die too." In the small room of the correctional center, Tyler sat, barely able to breathe. When Maria walked in, he began sobbing, repeating, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I wish it had been me." Maria looked at him, really looked, not as a killer, but as a boy who had destroyed a life but would carry that burden for the rest of his own. She said softly, "I believe you, and I forgive you." Tyler broke down. Later, Maria would say that the moment of forgiveness didn't bring back Leo, but it brought her something else, freedom. Now, years later, Maria volunteers at grief support groups. She doesn't speak of revenge. She speaks of release, of the weight that hatred carries, of the lightness that comes with letting go. In one of her talks, she ends with a sentence that never fails to quiet the room. Forgiveness is not for the person who hurt you. It's for the person you're becoming without the hurt. Story 3. A Japanese monk who survived the Hiroshima bombing forgives the American military. He was once an 11-year-old boy living in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Hiroshima. On that morning, August 6, 1945, he woke up early to go to the market with his mother. Just minutes later, a blinding flash tore through the sky, followed by a wave of searing heat, like hellfire sweeping through everything. He regained consciousness buried under rubble, his face burned and scorched. His mother was gone. The city had turned to ashes. He was one of the few who survived. And from that moment on, a fire of anger began to smolder in his heart. At first, it was confusion, then rage, then hatred towards the Americans, the war, and even the gods he had once prayed to. He had survived, but he wasn't truly living. He grew up in refugee shelters, with scars both on his skin and deep within his soul. In his mind, those who dropped the bomb weren't human. They were demons wearing the mask of civilization. He once swore he would never forgive. But life took him in an unexpected direction. At the age of 25, in the depths of a severe depression, he sought refuge at a Buddhist temple in Kyoto, not to pray, but simply to escape. Yet that place opened a door he had never considered, the door of silence. At first, he hated the silence. It made him hear the screams inside himself more clearly. But the more he sat, the more still he became, the more something began to soften. One day, during a long meditation, he suddenly broke down and cried, not out of rage, but because, for the first time in his life, he felt exhausted by his hatred. He stayed at the temple. He studied, not to find a new religion, but to learn how to live with himself. Years passed, and he became a monk, not a famous one, not loud in preaching, but quietly living and meditating in a small temple near a pine forest. Every year on August 6th, he would still light candles, but no longer to pray for vengeance. Now, he prayed for all who had died, both Japanese and Americans. One year, a group of American students visited the temple. A boy in the group, after hearing a little about the monk's past, awkwardly asked, "Do you hate my country, sir?" The monk smiled, a soft smile, like a passing breeze, but carrying the weight of decades of contemplation. "No, I once carried that fire of hatred. It burned my mind every single day. But then I realized, if I don't put it down, it is I who will be consumed." That sentence was later recorded by the students, widely shared, and became a symbol of forgiveness. Many people asked him, "How could you forgive those who destroyed your family?" He simply replied, "Because I didn't want them to destroy me a second time, this time in my own heart." Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it severs the chain that binds us to its suffering. In the darkness of war and hatred, compassion can still bloom, like a lotus rising from bloody mud, quietly, but brilliantly. Story 4. The Journey of Forgiveness Behind Bars, a former inmate's reflection. I never thought I would end up in prison, not as a guard, but as an inmate. And I never imagined that in such a dark and confined place, I would learn one of life's deepest lessons, forgiveness. I was once a man filled with anger. I hated life. I hated people. I even hated myself. I grew up in a violent home, an alcoholic father, a battered mother, and a childhood wrapped in shouting and breaking things. I made a vow early on. No one would ever hurt me again. I kept that vow by becoming someone others feared. I fought. I stole. And eventually, I committed a crime so serious that there was no turning back. I was sentenced to life in prison. The first few years behind bars were just survival. I was still a beast, ready to bite at the first threat. But one day, a group of Buddhist monks came to the prison. I didn't care. Religion? Morality? Just tools for the weak, I thought. Then one day, while trying to avoid a fight in the yard, I wandered into the meditation room. I didn't go in to meditate. I just needed a quiet corner. But I sat down. I closed my eyes. And that small act changed everything. An elderly monk approached me. He didn't ask about my crimes. He didn't preach. He simply said, "You are not what you've done. You are what you choose to become today." That sentence haunted me. I couldn't sleep that night. I started thinking about my parents, the people I'd hurt, the life I'd wasted. And I realized something. I had never forgiven anyone, not even myself. From that day on, I started meditating once a week. 5 minutes at first, then 10, then 30. In that silence, memories I had buried began to surface. I saw the child inside me crying. I saw the man I assaulted falling to the ground. I saw my mother's face, without a smile. And I cried, not out of fear, but out of remorse. I started writing letters, not to be sent, but to speak the words I had long silenced. To my mother, though she had passed. To the woman I had once loved and hurt. To the boy I used to be, not to be forgiven, but to say I was sorry. Little by little, my heart grew lighter. Not because the world changed, but because I was no longer carrying the weight. I once thought forgiveness was a gift we give others. I now know it's the first gift we give ourselves, to stop being prisoners of the past. I'm still in prison, but I'm not the man I once was. One day, a young inmate asked me, "You forgave them? After everything they did to you?" I smiled and replied, "If I didn't, what then? Carry all that rage to the grave? That's exhausting." And I returned to the meditation room. In the glow of a single candle, I closed my eyes. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't afraid. I was just a human being, learning to rebuild from the ruins of his own making. Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it lightens the present. When we let go of hate, we don't just free the other, we unlock the door to our own liberation. Letting go of resentment, the mind becomes like a cloudless sky. In the teachings of the Buddha, few things bind the human heart as deeply as anger and resentment. The Buddha taught that anger not only destroys the present moment, but also sows seeds of suffering far into future lifetimes. Holding on to hatred is like clutching a burning coal with the intent to throw it at someone else, only to burn oneself first. The saying, "letting go of resentment, the mind becomes like a cloudless sky," is not merely poetic imagery. It is a profound metaphor in Buddhism. The dark clouds represent hatred, endless mental loops of who hurt me, who's right or wrong, and how I must repay the pain. These clouds don't just block the light of compassion, they also weigh the heart down, obscuring clarity and direction. But once resentment is released, the mind becomes as light as drifting clouds, clear as the sky after a storm, no longer driven by past wounds or bitterness. The person returns to their original nature, a mind free from attachments, open and vast like the sky itself. In the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the loving-kindness discourse, the Buddha taught his disciples to radiate loving-kindness toward all beings, without exception, including those who have harmed us. This is not just moral idealism. It is a profound medicine to transform the root of anger, which is the root of suffering. Letting go of hatred, in Buddhist practice, is not weakness or submission, but an act of deep wisdom. As long as we are angry, we are not truly free. But when we forgive and release, we are the ones who unlock the chains that have bound our hearts. No one can force us to forgive. No one can demand that we release our hatred. But through mindfulness, compassion, and wise contemplation, as the Buddha taught, we can, even in this very life, touch the state of a cloudless mind. A mind free from hatred, radiant, and filled with peace. Part 4. When the enemy cries, facing the one who caused the tragedy. There are wounds we believe we will never be able to forgive until the moment we stand face to face with the one who caused them. When the person we once called the enemy unexpectedly bows their head, when the hand that once hurt us now trembles in remorse, how will our heart respond? Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, nor does it mean abandoning justice or justifying wrongdoing. Forgiveness is a journey of confrontation, confronting ourselves, our pain, and the human being who hurt us. When the enemy cries, we might see that they too are victims of anger, ignorance, or a vicious cycle of karma. Or perhaps not, but only when we dare to face them, to look at them without being consumed by hatred. Can we truly understand? Forgiveness is a form of strength, a strength not to defeat others, but to liberate ourselves. Story 1. A dialogue between victim and murderer. Based on real cases in Canada, Rwanda, and the United States. No one imagined the day would come when a mother, who had lost her child to a brutal murder, would sit face to face with the man who took that life. No courtroom, no lawyers, just a small room and two people facing each other in breathless silence. This was the scene in a real-life program known as restorative justice, practiced in Canada, post-genocide Rwanda, and several U.S. states. The mother spoke. "I used to want you to suffer the way I do. But then I realized, My hatred wouldn't bring my child back. It was only burning my own soul, day after day. The murderer lowered his head. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. But if this pain can be used to help someone else, I'll carry it for the rest of my life. Their story didn't end with a handshake or a smile. But from that day forward, the mother could finally sleep. She could look at the sun without feeling like it scorched her from the inside. The man, after that conversation, began writing apology letters to the families of other victims, not for forgiveness, but to begin confronting his own humanity. In Rwanda, after a genocide that killed over 800,000 people, thousands of such dialogues took place. Some cried, some walked out in silence, but others, after 20 years of harboring rage, reached out a trembling hand and placed it on the shoulder of someone who once destroyed their world, just to say, I haven't forgotten, but I don't want to carry this burden anymore. In the U.S., in another case, a young woman was raped and murdered. Years later, her mother, after surviving a breakdown and undergoing therapy, requested to meet her daughter's killer in prison. No one understood why. She only said, I need to see the human being in him. Facing someone doesn't mean excusing them. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. Sometimes it's simply saying, I refuse to let you live inside my mind for one more day. Story 2. A Tibetan monk forgives his torturer after 20 years. A true story of Palden Gyatso, a Tibetan monk who survived nearly 30 years of imprisonment. Palden Gyatso was a Tibetan Buddhist monk who was arrested in 1959 after the Chinese occupation of Tibet. He spent 33 years in Chinese prisons and labor camps, enduring brutal torture, electric shocks, beatings, starvation, and relentless efforts to force him to renounce his faith. And yet, throughout those years, Palden never abandoned his compassion. He later said that the thing he feared most was not physical pain, but the possibility of losing compassion for his torturers. What frightened me most was the thought that I might begin to hate them. And if that happened, I knew I would truly be imprisoned. After his release and exile to India, he continued to live a modest monastic life. Many years later, at an international human rights conference in Europe, Palden unexpectedly came face to face with an elderly man, one of the very guards who had tortured him in prison. The room fell silent. The former soldier lowered his head, tears filling his eyes. Palden stood still for a long moment. No one knew what would happen next. Then, he quietly walked forward, placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder, and said in a low voice, I forgive you. The man broke down in tears, not because he was forgiven, but because he never believed he deserved it. Palden never forgot what had happened. The scars on his body were proof, but he chose not to let those memories poison his heart. If I continued to hold hatred, I would be no different from the people who kept me in a cell for 30 years. I had walked out of the prison. My mind had to be free too. His story has been shared in several books and international documentaries, including The Shadow of the Dalai Lama and Fire Under the Snow. Palden Gyatso passed away in 2018, but his story of forgiveness continues to echo across the world, a living testament that compassion is not weakness, but the deepest spiritual strength. Story 3. The girl who wrote a letter to her brother's killer and received a tearful reply. 2 years after her brother was killed in a bar fight on the outskirts of Boston, Elena decided to write a letter. Not to curse, not to unleash hatred, but to understand. Elena had never met the man who took her brother's life. His name was Marcus, 27 years old, once a promising athlete who had spiraled into alcohol and violence. That night, over a minor confrontation, Marcus pulled a knife, and everything ended in seconds. Elena's brother fell and never came home again. Her family was plunged into grief. Her father stopped speaking. Her mother wept every night. As for Elena, she fought daily with emptiness and an unrelenting rage. But then, one day, she came across a line in a Buddhist book. Forgiveness isn't because others deserve it, but because your own heart needs to be free. And in that moment, she realized she couldn't keep living like a prisoner of her own bitterness. She began writing, not just one letter, but many, only to tear them up again. She wrote, she cried, again and again, until, one winter morning, she finally walked to the post office with an envelope in hand. It was addressed to the prison where Marcus was serving a 25-year sentence. The letter was simple but sincere. I'm the sister of the man you killed. I used to wish you would suffer forever, that you'd feel exactly what we've felt. But now, I just want to understand, what really happened that night? What did you think of my brother? And, have you ever felt regret? A month later, Marcus replied. The letter was long, the handwriting shaky. No excuses, no justifications, just a heartbreaking account of a wasted youth, years of drunkenness. And the image that haunted him every night, the face of the man he killed. He wrote, I don't dare ask for forgiveness. I don't believe I deserve it. But the fact that you wrote to me, I cried all night. Maybe, for the first time in my life, I felt something like humanity. Elena never replied again. She didn't need to. Some door within her had quietly opened. No one had forced her to forgive. She didn't consider herself noble. But strangely, after that letter, she began to sleep better. The tightness in her chest eased. She could look at her brother's photo without feeling guilty for being alive. Sometimes, we don't need the other person to change. We only need our own heart to stop closing. Story 4. The father who forgave his daughter's killer on live television. Based on the true story of Bassam Aramin and his path of forgiveness. Bassam Aramin is a Palestinian father living in the West Bank, a land long scarred by grief and hatred. He was once a prisoner, a man who harbored deep resentment toward Israel, convinced that violence was the only way to reclaim justice. But everything changed one fateful afternoon in 2007, when his 10-year-old daughter, Abir, was shot in the head with a rubber bullet by an Israeli soldier while standing outside her school. She died in his arms. No goodbye, no chance to say, I love you. Palestinian media exploded in outrage. The international community protested. But Bassam, he simply sat in silence, cradling his daughter's blood-soaked shoes. In that moment, everything he believed in, revenge, resistance, justice, collapsed like sand. And yet, he didn't do what many expected. He did not scream. He did not call for retaliation. Instead, he stood in front of television cameras, voice trembling but clear, and said, I forgive the one who killed my daughter. Not because they deserve it, but because if I don't, I will kill my own soul every day. The world was stunned. A father who had just lost his child to violence, choosing to forgive publicly, in a land where hatred has been passed down like inheritance. Bassam didn't deny the pain. He never said forgiveness was easy. Every day, he still remembers Abir's eyes, hears her laughter in the wind. But he understood something deeper. If he continued to hate, Abir would never rest in peace. If he sowed more anger, he would become no different from the man who pulled the trigger. So he joined hands with Rami El-Hanan, an Israeli father who had lost his own daughter in a bombing, and together they founded the Parents' Circle, Families Forum, a grassroots organization where bereaved families from both sides of the conflict come together to share their pain and choose peace. Not everyone understood. Some called him a traitor. Others called him weak. But Bassam simply smiled and said, I am not weak. I chose the hardest path, to forgive while my heart is still bleeding. Bassam's story isn't about being noble or saintly. It's about a man who walked through unimaginable sorrow and still chose not to be consumed by the darkness. Forgiveness, sometimes, is the bravest thing a human being can do, not because the other deserves to be forgiven, but because our own soul deserves to be free. Buddhist philosophy, forgiveness does not deny justice, but it is the first step in ending the cycle of hatred. In Buddhist thought, forgiveness does not mean forgetting, overlooking, or denying the suffering we have endured. Forgiveness is not a free pass for the one who caused the tragedy. Rather, forgiveness is how we stop that pain from becoming a permanent part of ourselves. It is how we free our own hearts from the chains of resentment. The Buddha taught that every action carries karmic consequences. Those who cause suffering will, sooner or later, face the fruits of their deeds. But if we continue to hold on to hatred, then we are also generating new karma. It's like grasping a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at someone. Our own hand is the first to be burned. Forgiveness, according to the Dharma, is the refusal to let old karma lead us into the endless cycle of anger, revenge, and further hatred. It is the beginning of awakening, the moment we step out of the game of rage and return to inner peace. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha said, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By love alone is hatred appeased. This is an eternal law. On a deeper level, Buddhism sees every life event, even deep loss and trauma, as part of a karmic stream flowing through many lifetimes. Forgiveness becomes the most courageous act, the courage to face ourselves, our wounds, and the truth that everything is impermanent and ever-changing. Buddhism does not deny justice, but justice, in the light of Dharma, does not always mean punishment. It can mean transformation, a space where both victim and offender are given the chance to awaken. Some courtrooms cannot bring peace, but a release from within can offer a liberation far deeper than any sentence. A living example of this is the practice of restorative justice, found in many parts of the world, where victims and perpetrators are brought into a safe space to speak, listen, and recognize each other's humanity. These encounters may not change the past, but they often reshape the future for both sides. In Buddhism, forgiveness is not weakness. It is the highest expression of compassion. Compassion for ourselves, and for all beings caught in the wheel of samsara. When we forgive, we are not saying the wrong was right. We are saying, I will no longer let the past imprison my heart. Forgiveness is not a destination, it is a process. Some wounds take time to heal, but the moment we take a single step toward letting go, we have already chosen a different path, the path of liberation, not repetition. Part 5. Forgiveness in darkness. Light at the depths of suffering. There are pains that seem beyond words. There are places so dark that light appears unable to reach. A prison cell buried underground. A hospital ward where death lingers. A moment of sudden loss, where no farewell could be spoken. In such moments, forgiveness is not an easy choice. It is not a quick act of nobility, nor is it forgetting. It is a small flame, kept alive with every ounce of strength one has left. A sigh in the dark. A silent hand held in sorrow. A tear that falls, not from weakness, but from a heart that still chooses to feel. When suffering reaches its deepest point, something strange happens. We begin to see the way back. In the very depths of pain, if the heart has not completely shut down, compassion can take root, quietly, yet steadfastly. Story 1. The death row inmate who learned to forgive before dying. His name was Miguel Rivera. Born in a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles, Miguel grew up in violence, starved of love, and quickly fell into a life of crime. At the age of 26, he was sentenced to death for a murder committed during a drug dispute. In society's eyes, Miguel was a man best forgotten. But his story didn't end with the sentence. In his 8th year on death row, Miguel happened upon a Vipassana meditation program offered in the prison. At first, he didn't believe in anything, not in meditation, not in religion, and certainly not in redemption. But during those first few days of sitting in silence, something inside him began to shift. I never knew pain could be so quiet, Miguel wrote in his journal. It wasn't the sound of gunshots or screams. It was the echo of my mistakes, playing over and over in my head. Gradually, Miguel learned to observe his own mind. He recalled the terrified eyes of the man he killed. He remembered his mother's sobs in the courtroom. He remembered himself, as a child who had been starved, beaten, and desperately yearning to be loved. And for the first time in his life, Miguel cried. Not because he feared death, but because he finally saw how deeply he had lost both his humanity and his chance to live a meaningful life. One morning, he wrote a letter to the victim's family. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply shared his journey, from resentment to silence, denial to acceptance, hatred to remorse. The letter received no reply, but Miguel said that no longer mattered. I used to think I was a victim of circumstance, he wrote, that I had no choice. But now I know, I did have a choice, and I chose wrong. Forgiveness is no longer something I expect to receive. It's something I must learn to give, just once before I go. As the date of his execution approached, a Buddhist nun visited Miguel. She didn't ask many questions. She simply sat with him, breathing, and softly chanting a short sutra on loving kindness. In his final moments, Miguel closed his eyes. In his heart, he sent wishes of peace to his parents, whom he once resented, to the man whose life he took, and to himself, the forgotten boy and the remorseful man. As the final injection entered his body, Miguel neither cried nor smiled. He simply exhaled, long and deep, as if, at last, he was free, not from the prison walls, but from a far greater prison, the hatred within. Story 2. The cellmate and the memory no one wanted to recall. In a maximum security prison in Chile, where time seems frozen between stone walls and hope is a flickering candle, two men had shared a cell for 4 years. Joaquin, a quiet man serving a 20-year sentence for armed robbery, and Mateo, a former schoolteacher, now serving life in prison for a crime of passion. In the beginning, they hardly spoke. But when a mindfulness meditation program was introduced in the prison, both joined, partly out of curiosity, partly to escape the daily violence and screaming within those walls. Day after day, they sat in silence together, learning to observe their breath, their emotions, and, most painfully, the past they had long avoided. One afternoon, during a session focusing on sending loving kindness to those we've hurt and those who've hurt us, Mateo broke into tears. Later that day, he quietly asked to speak with Joaquin. In their cell, Mateo pulled out an old, yellowed newspaper clipping, his hands trembling. He pointed to a small article. In 2001, a family of 3 was murdered during a robbery in the outskirts of Santiago. The perpetrator was never found. Joaquin froze. That was his family, his wife and 2 young children, slain one night while he had stayed late at work. He had survived by accident. The case had gone cold, unanswered. Mateo choked up, whispering, "I didn't realize, until you spoke of your family a few months ago. Then the dreams came. Their faces, their house, the little girl's eyes. I can't deny it anymore. I was there." The air in the room turned to ice. Joaquin stood, hands trembling, his eyes burning red. "What did you say?" Mateo bowed his head, voice cracking. "I thought it was just a robbery. But in the panic, I did something unforgivable. I can't ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I can't live with this lie between us." That night, Joaquin didn't sleep. He stared at the faded photo of his family, remembering laughter, dinners, promises unkept. The next morning, he attended the meditation session. The elderly monk patiently spoke of karma, of anger as a fire that burns only the one who holds it. Joaquin sat, eyes closed. Memories surged back, but this time, not just blood and screams, but a question. If I hold on to this hatred forever, will my loved ones ever truly rest? When the session ended, Joaquin returned to the cell. Mateo was still there, silent, head bowed, not eating, not moving. Joaquin spoke, quietly, as if to himself. "I don't forgive you because you deserve it. I forgive because I don't want this pain to live inside me anymore." Mateo broke down like a child. The two sat there, not as inmates, but as 2 shattered souls, learning how to mend themselves through breath, through truth, and through something no prison ever teaches: compassion. Story 3. Palden Gyatso, forgiveness without forgetting. If you've ever seen an image of an elderly monk, small in stature, holding a pair of rusty shackles in his frail hands while standing solemnly at the United Nations Human Rights Council, that was Palden Gyatso, a living symbol of resilience and boundless compassion, and spent 33 years behind bars. He endured brutal torture, forced labor, and relentless political indoctrination. The torture devices he later displayed, from electric prods to iron cuffs, were not kept to fuel hatred, but to show the world the truth of what had happened. When he was finally released in 1992 and managed to escape to India, he appeared before the world, not with rage, but with an extraordinary calm in his eyes. At international conferences, he recounted his suffering in painful detail. He didn't downplay it. He didn't look away, but neither did he incite hatred. Someone once asked him, "Do you hate the people who did this to you?" Nor pretending the suffering didn't happen. Quite the opposite. Forgiveness is facing the memory, looking directly at it, and choosing to release the burden of resentment. A journalist once asked him, "If you forgive, aren't you denying justice?" He smiled gently. "No. Forgiveness is what allows justice to happen, without becoming vengeance." The most powerful lesson Palden left behind didn't lie in eloquent words, but in his presence, a man who had been stripped of everything: freedom, youth, health, yet who still carried an inner light. To him, forgiveness was not a gift for the oppressor, but a liberation for the self. And the reason he kept the instruments of his torture wasn't to relive the pain, but to remind the world, we must remember, so we do not repeat. Palden Gyatso passed away in 2018. the orphan girl who became a nun and cared for the child of her enemy. The day the small village at the foot of the Himalayas was bombed, Amara was only 8 years old. She had been playing with a puppy in the garden when an explosion tore through the evening sky. Flames engulfed the house where her parents had been having dinner. She didn't cry for her lost parents. She cried because she realized, all those years, she hadn't truly lived. She had only existed, trapped in hatred. She asked her teacher for permission to descend the mountain, to go out into the world, to serve the suffering. That journey led her to a poor region where she came across a sickly boy abandoned by the roadside. No one wanted to take him in. Rumors said his mother had been a prostitute. His pale face half hidden beneath tangled hair, Amara suddenly realized. This child was not her past. He was her present, a chance to end a karmic cycle. And so she stayed. She cooked for him, took him to the doctor, and lulled him to sleep with soft Buddhist chants. At first, the villagers gossiped. But over time, they watched the boy grow up in peace. And Amara, once burdened with pain, now smiled more, her eyes clearer. Years later, when the boy was grown, Amara finally told him the truth. He fell silent, then embraced her and wept. She only said, "If I hadn't cared for you." But her story was passed down through generations in that little village, as a lesson that needs no explanation. Sometimes, the only way to overcome hatred is not to forget, but to plant a new seed in the very soil once soaked with blood. Excerpt from the Sutras: light the lamp where it is darkest, for that is where light is needed most. There is a line in the Buddhist Sutras that sounds simple, yet holds immense transformative power. Light the lamp where it is darkest. Not everyone who suffers can forgive. Not everyone who causes pain desires forgiveness. Yet the compassionate heart of one who walks the spiritual path is a lamp that does not discriminate. The more forgotten the place, the more it is engulfed by resentment, injustice, or despair, the more it needs light. In the history of Buddhism, the Buddha himself returned to teach even those like Angulimala, a man who had murdered dozens. The Buddha did not deny the weight of his crimes, but he offered the light of wisdom. It comes from presence without judgment, from unconditional compassion, from silence that listens deeply, and from a sincere aspiration to dissolve hatred through understanding. And often, but from our own inability to stop blaming ourselves for a wrong choice, a harsh word said in anger, or a moment when we turned away from what we knew was right. Forgiving others is already difficult, but forgiving ourselves, that is the step many cannot take. They live with guilt like a sentence with no end. They refuse to allow themselves to heal, believing they don't deserve it. But the Buddha taught, no one is entirely sinful, and no one entirely pure. A mind that truly repents has already begun its liberation. But about the enemy within our own mind, and the journey to rediscover gentleness toward oneself after mistakes that once seemed unforgivable. Story 1. The mother who couldn't forgive herself for her child's death. In a small town in northern Italy, where winter came early and snow blanketed the streets, there lived a woman named Elena. She sentenced herself. She left their old home, withdrew from friends, and refused help from anyone. For years, she lived with only two things, memory and self-punishment. Every night, she visited a Thai Buddhist monk who lived in a small rural monastery nearby. Elena wasn't religious, but perhaps she just needed someone, anyone, to say, "You can still be forgiven." The old monk didn't tell her to forget. He didn't say, "You're not to blame," like others had. Instead, he said gently, "Your son is gone, but your pain is still alive." She came to the monastery each week, not to pray, but to sit in stillness. Sometimes she watered plants, cleaned statues, or simply watched the clouds pass. In those quiet, ordinary moments, her face still held wrinkles, but it no longer strained beneath guilt. She placed a white chrysanthemum on her son's grave and whispered, "Though you're gone, I'm still alive. And I'll live as if you're watching over me, not out of guilt, but out of love." That mother finally learned what many never do. To forgive herself, not to erase the past. For freedom. But war was never as simple as the slogans made it seem. One hot afternoon in 2004, in the dusty plains of Afghanistan, only civilians, one of them a boy no older than 10, caught by a stray bullet. Raymond had pulled the trigger. That single moment, lasting only seconds, followed him for the rest of his life. At first, he tried to forget. Like many veterans, Raymond returned to the U.S. with medals, applause, and haunting nightmares. He drank to sleep, distanced himself from his family, and withdrew from the world. At one point, he even contemplated ending his life. Then, in 2012, at a meditation retreat for veterans suffering from PTSD, a Buddhist teacher shared a single line. Guilt isn't erased by running from it. It dissolves only when we face it and transform it. For the first time, Raymond didn't push it away. He didn't deny it. Mostly helping people from the Middle East. At first, he felt unworthy. But he began fixing homes, teaching English, cooking meals, and listening. He never told anyone he had once been a soldier. He simply served, quietly and consistently. Years later, a young Syrian boy once asked him, "Why do you help us, even though you're not from here?" Raymond smiled and softly replied, "I'm trying to give back something I once took away." No one knew the full story, but they could feel something in him, a quiet humility, a compassion that asked for nothing in return. In his final years, Raymond lived in a Buddhist monastery in Oregon. Every morning, he swept the courtyard, tended the garden, and recited sutras. A journalist once asked him, "Do you think you've been forgiven?" Raymond looked up at the sky and answered, "I'm not seeking forgiveness from others. I just hope that the one I hurt, wherever they are, if they see me now, they won't be afraid of me anymore." That was his answer to the greatest question of his life. Story 3. The Monk Who Was Once a Criminal. A Journey of Redemption Through Walking Meditation. In a small temple on the outskirts of northern Thailand, there lived an old monk who rarely spoke. Each day, he walked barefoot along the red dirt path, slow, silent, and steady. No one knew exactly where he came from. People simply called him a John Cam. His name was Campton, a young man raised in violence, poverty, and neglect. At just 20, he was swept into a street fight and, in a blind rage, took a man's life. A life sentence without parole. For him, life as he knew it had ended behind prison bars. But inside that bleak prison, surrounded by pain and noise, something unexpected happened. A monk arrived, part of the Monks of Prison program, to teach meditation to inmates. Campton scoffed at first. Meditation? How could one find peace amidst shouting, chains? But the frightened child he had once been, beaten, abandoned, never held. And in that same silence, he began to hear echoes from the man he had killed and from the grieving family left behind. He didn't justify his actions. But from that moment, he made a vow. If he ever got the chance to live outside again, every breath would be used to atone. After over 20 years of incarceration and dedicated practice, with endorsements from senior monks and prison officials, Campton was released early for good behavior. He ordained as a monk shortly after, not to escape his guilt, but to embody a living, breathing act of repentance. Since then, a John Cam has walked into prisons, offering Dhamma to inmates. He sits among them, not as a preacher, but as someone who once sat in the same darkness. He doesn't speak lofty doctrines. He tells his story and teaches walking meditation, one slow step at a time. And to all who still struggled in the shadows of their own remorse, you are not the mistakes of your past. You are the possibility of transformation in the present. There are people who, for an entire lifetime, cannot forgive themselves. Not because they haven't tried, but because deep down they believe, "I am a terrible person." Once that belief takes root, even the most generous and kind-hearted actions become clouded by shame. They may care for others, serve, even dedicate their lives to doing good, but still carry a silent scar that whispers, "I don't deserve peace." In Buddhist teachings, no one is inherently evil. A person may have caused terrible harm, even committed grave crimes. When the conditions change, when awareness arises, the heart can awaken, and people can transform. Regret is only the first step. It is not the final destination. Many live endlessly in regret, like carrying a heavy stone on their back, unsure how to put it down. Forgiving yourself is not denying your mistakes. It is acknowledging them deeply and truthfully. We don't erase what happened, but we stop letting it define who we are. It's like a river that once carried debris and waste. If it continues to flow, if it is not blocked, the water can become clear again. Forgiveness allows the heart to keep flowing, not to remain stuck in a single moment of pain. Many monks and spiritual teachers were once people who made serious mistakes, even former convicts. But through meditation, mindful living, and spiritual practice, they unraveled the knots in their hearts. They didn't deny the darkness. They entered it with the light of compassion. One of the most beautiful images in Buddhist scriptures is that of a lamp lit in a deep cave. The light doesn't have to be powerful. As long as there is light, the darkness is no longer absolute. You are not the mistakes of your past. They are merely one part of a much greater journey. What defines who you are is how you live this present moment, with the courage to look back, the sincerity to transform, and the kindness to treat yourself gently. Don't let the past bind you with invisible chains of guilt. Remember, as long as you are still breathing, you still have a chance, you still have the capacity to love. And the miracle is this: when you learn to love and forgive yourself, your heart becomes more open to others. You become a stream of cool water, instead of a fire that consumes you from within. This may not be the easiest path, but it is the only one that leads to true freedom. Part 7. After forgiveness, when the heart becomes a torch. Some believe that forgiveness is the end point. That once you say, "I forgive you," everything will fade into the past and disappear. But those who have truly walked the path of forgiveness know it is only the beginning. Forgiveness is like shedding a heavy suit of armor worn for too long, so that you can start learning how to live again with a bare heart, yet one stronger than ever before. After forgiveness, life does not go back to how it was. It transforms. The relationship with oneself and with others deepens and becomes more honest. Those once wounded may become guides for others. And forgiveness ceases to be a single act. It becomes a way of life. A quiet torch lighting the night, fueled by the pain that has been transformed into compassion. Story 1. I didn't cry at his funeral, she said. It felt like my soul had frozen. The one who committed the act was a 17-year-old boy named Arif, of Turkish descent. He had grown up in poverty, surrounded by violence and neglect. Arif was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But for Marianne, no sentence could ever fill the void Jonas left behind. A year after the trial, Marianne received a letter. It was from Arif. In the letter, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply wrote about his sleepless nights, the recurring nightmares of Jonas's eyes right before he fell. The letter didn't ease her pain, but it opened a small crack in the walls of her grief. She couldn't forgive, not yet, but something inside her no longer wanted to hate. Marianne began visiting the prison. At first, just to listen. Then, to speak. She told Arif she hadn't forgiven him, but she was trying not to feed the hatred. For 3 years, they met regularly. Their conversations were raw and painful, not to forget the past, but to look at it honestly and ask, what can we do with this pain? One day, Marianne saw a child standing outside a supermarket asking for money. Why aren't you in school? She asked. The boy replied, who cares if I go to school? That sentence struck her deeply. She realized Jonas could not come back. But if there were still children like Arif, lost and unloved, perhaps her pain could become something meaningful. She founded a small organization called Jonas Licht, Jonas's Light. Its mission was to support at-risk youth through counseling, education, and most importantly, creating a space where they felt seen, heard, and cared for. At first, no one believed a grieving mother could help the kind of children who had taken her son's life. But Marianne wasn't doing it for praise. She did it because she understood. If a child like Arif had been loved early on, Jonas might still be alive. Over the years, her center helped hundreds of teens finish school, find decent jobs, and even return to help others. When Arif was released, he became a mentor at the center, not to erase his past, but to give back something good to the world. In a televised interview, when asked what led her to forgive, Marianne simply smiled. Forgiveness didn't bring my son back, but it allowed me to live. If my heart can turn pain into light, then so can theirs. Story 2. The victim who became a community reconciliation teacher. Based on a true story from the Peace Circles program in the United States. Her name was Annabelle Hayes, a resident of Minneapolis, Minnesota. In 2006, her only son, Tyrone, just 19 years old, was shot and killed during a violent clash between youth groups. The shooter was a 16-year-old boy named Jamal, from a neighborhood just across the street. Annabelle had worked as a nurse, kind, compassionate, always ready to help others. But after her son's death, her world collapsed into darkness. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Each morning, she woke up wishing she hadn't. Rage consumed her, rage toward Jamal, and toward the world that had created such a young killer. Her life could have remained in that abyss of grief and bitterness. But one day, she learned about a program called Peace Circles, safe spaces where victims, offenders, and community members gather in circles to speak, to listen, to heal. At first, Annabelle refused. "I don't want dialogue," she said. "I want justice." But over time, the weight of her sorrow began to suffocate her spirit. She asked herself, could justice truly ease this pain? Or was there another way to live with it? After months of reflection, she agreed to attend her first peace circle. She was told she didn't have to forgive. She only needed to listen and to be heard. At one gathering, Jamal, now older and serving his sentence, was invited to participate. Facing the boy who had taken her son's life, Annabelle trembled. But what she heard was not defiance. It was a shaking voice, thick with emotion. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know, I wish someone had stopped me. I didn't understand what I was doing until I saw my own mother cry the way you cried for your son." That conversation didn't erase her grief, but it changed everything. Annabelle realized hatred wasn't the only way to honor her son's memory. There was another path, one just as painful, but far more powerful, transforming pain into purpose. From that moment on, she became more than a participant. She became a teacher. Annabelle began sharing her story in universities, prisons, and community centers, becoming an educator in community reconciliation and restorative justice. She didn't speak to relive the pain, but to prove that forgiveness is not the absence of justice. It's the presence of a second chance, for others and for yourself. Years later, when asked whether she regretted choosing this path, she answered, "If I had clung to hatred, my son would have died twice, once by the bullet and once inside the locked heart of his mother. I chose to open my heart so his life could continue in another form." Story 3. The former death row inmate who now teaches the Dharma and compassion. Inspired by real cases across Asia. In a small village in northern Thailand, the locals gather every Sunday morning to listen to a man share the teachings of the Buddha. He is not a formal monk. He wears no saffron robes and has no temple of his own. But his words are like a cool stream, gentle and clear, bringing tears to the eyes of those who listen. His name is Chaiwat. Few people know that he was once on death row. In his youth, he scratched time into the walls as he awaited execution. For years, he lived in bitterness, blaming fate, blaming others, never himself. But one day, an elderly monk was granted access to the prison to teach the Dharma. No one knows why, but something about the monk's serene voice and compassionate presence broke through Chaiwat's defenses. For the first time in years, he cried, not out of fear of death, but because he had finally seen himself clearly, a man who had lost his humanity. From that day on, Chaiwat began to meditate and chant sutras in solitude. He no longer wished to live, but he wanted to die with awareness. This profound inner shift caught the attention of the prison staff. They allowed him access to books, spiritual guidance, and further contact with visiting monks. Eventually, because of his remarkable transformation, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He remained in prison for 15 more years, living as a spiritual practitioner. He taught mindfulness to other inmates, spoke about karma, and guided them to listen to their own breath instead of the chaos around them. By the time he was released, he was a completely different man. But instead of returning to a quiet life in his hometown, Chaiwat chose to travel from village to village, visiting schools and juvenile centers to share his story, not to cleanse his past, but to awaken others. "I do not come here seeking forgiveness. I come to speak of the power of transformation, that even in those once shackled by their own darkness, the seed of compassion still exists." He shared what it meant to wake up in the depths of despair, how his first meditation session brought overwhelming waves of regret, how he once considered taking his own life because he couldn't bear the weight of what he had done. And yet, from that very bottom, he saw a flicker of light, the calm gaze of the old monk. A line from a sutra that said, "Wrongdoing is not our essence. It is only the clouds hiding the sun." People listened, not to fear him, but to believe in something again. That if a man who once took lives could turn his own life around, then no one is beyond redemption. Today, Chaiwat no longer counts the days as he did in prison. He counts the hearts moved by his words, the young people who cry in his arms, the troubled souls who rise again after hearing his story. He is living proof of a truth the Buddha once taught. There is no path to compassion. Compassion is the path. Story 4. The Monk's Tale. Forgiveness is a path without end. In a small monastery nestled beneath the Annapurna Mountains in Nepal, lived an elderly monk lovingly called Lama Dorje. He wasn't famous. You wouldn't see him at major conferences or on television. But whenever Lama Dorje told stories, the whole monastery seemed to fall silent. For in his quiet words lived an entire lifetime, scarred, tearful, and luminous. One autumn afternoon, as a soft fog blanketed the sky and the last leaves fell on the monastery roof, Lama Dorje sat with a group of young children sent to the temple to study and practice Dharma. He didn't deliver a formal sermon. He simply told a story. And, as always, no one knew whether the story was about someone else or about himself. Long ago, he began, his voice low and warm. There was a young man who carried a deep wound, not one inflicted by others, but one he had inflicted on himself, through anger, through wrong choices. He had once hurt his mother, and she passed away before he could ask for forgiveness. The children fell silent. Lama Dorje's eyes looked into the distance, as if seeing his own past. The young man wandered across many lands with that regret. He studied meditation, chanted sutras, went on pilgrimages. Yet in the quiet of night, when the temple bell ceased to ring, his heart still cried out one question. How can I ever forgive myself? A young boy whispered. Then what happened, master? Lama Dorje smiled, his gaze tender as mountain spring water. One day, he met an old meditation teacher who told him just one thing. Forgiveness is not a destination. It is a path, and that path never ends. From that moment, the young man no longer sought forgiveness as a finish line. He lived each day with compassion. He cared for the elderly, taught children, and sat in silent meditation. He came to understand that while he couldn't erase the past, he could plant lotus flowers along the road ahead. A little girl frowned. But master, if the wound never goes away, how can someone live happily? Lama Dorje nodded. Happiness doesn't mean the absence of pain. It means embracing that pain with a gentle heart. Forgiveness doesn't erase the wound. It simply teaches us how to live with it without being burned. And don't think of forgiveness as a single moment. It is a practice. Some days you'll feel light and free, and some days you may fall back into the pit. But that's okay. Just return to your breath. Return to kindness. Each day, you forgive a little more. The air grew still. The children sat motionless. The sun had set behind the mountains. But in their eyes, a small flame had been lit. No one asked anything more, for some answers require no words. Years later, from that single story, one of those children became a teacher, another a doctor, and yet another became a monk. But all of them carried the same lesson within them, that forgiveness is not an end, but the beginning of a path with no end. A journey where each step is a quiet prayer. May I be soft enough to forgive, and strong enough to continue forgiving each day. Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it opens a future that never existed before. There is something that those who have truly walked the path of forgiveness all come to understand. Forgiveness cannot erase what has happened. There is no magic word that makes pain disappear. No spiritual practice can rewrite the past. But forgiveness awakens a new future, a different current of life, where a once broken heart becomes a gentle source of light for oneself and for others. Throughout this journey, we've just walked together, from those who caused pain, to the silent victims, to the mothers who lost their children, to those who once committed grave mistakes and are now transforming. We've seen one truth. Forgiveness doesn't end with a word or a tear. It begins there. From the moment we release resentment, another door begins to open. The door of understanding, of compassion, of a new way of living. A mother who lost her child can turn grief into compassion and create a program to help troubled youth. A former prisoner can carry his story across cities and countries, planting seeds of kindness in barren lands of the heart. A monk who once lived in darkness can become a lamp for others who have lost their way. And even ordinary people, like you, like me, can quietly change the world, simply by refusing to let pain pass through us into others. Because forgiveness is not surrender. Forgiveness is a conscious act to break the chain of karma. It is the decision not to plant more seeds of hatred, but instead to water the seeds of understanding. It is sitting down with one's own past, not to fight it, but to make peace with it. Some may ask, is forgiveness truly fair? Do those who hurt us deserve to be forgiven? The answer is this. Forgiveness is not a gift for the other person. It is a gift we give ourselves. Not to deny justice, but to keep our hearts from turning to stone. Not to say that everything was okay, but to free ourselves from the prison of bitterness. And strangely enough, when we choose to drop the chains, we finally realize we were not born to hate. We were born to heal. A forgiven heart is a free heart, in the soft glow of meditation. But it changes the person who looks back at that past. And when that gaze changes, a future that never existed before suddenly becomes possible. A future where the old wounds don't repeat themselves. A future no longer tangled in karmic debts. A future where people understand each other more, love each other more, and learn to walk through darkness by the light they discover inside themselves. Not reliant on circumstances, but born from a heart that has been transformed. Each story on this journey, from unimaginable pain to unthinkable forgiveness, is a mirror reflecting the deep nature of humanity, the capacity to endure, the capacity to change, and above all, the capacity to open our hearts even after they've been shattered. Some forgive out of love, some forgive out of faith, no longer allowing the darkness of others to obscure your own inner light. The path of forgiveness is not an easy one. It takes time. It takes courage. It takes falling down and standing back up again and again. But precisely because of that, forgiveness becomes something sacred, like a lamp lit after a long night, like a lotus blooming from the depths of mud. In the Buddhist spirit, all suffering can be transformed. Every injustice is an opportunity to understand more deeply the truths of karma, impermanence, and compassion. And once the mind is at peace, we begin to see clearly. Those who hurt us are also suffering, also lost, and we ourselves were never perfect either. Then, don't search for peace out there. It can only begin within you. If you feel these stories have touched your heart, please share them as a seed of compassion planted into the world. Perhaps someone, somewhere, lost in darkness, will find a spark of light. There are wounds that let a person keep breathing, but only as a shell of who they used to be. Not a physical death, but a quiet crumbling from within. The place where hope once lived now replaced by an unbearable emptiness. Loss is something everyone faces in life, but some losses strike too suddenly, too cruelly, leaving the survivor unable to make sense of what happened, let alone find a way to heal. There are tragedies so deep that even words fall short. They defy logic. They mock justice. And they leave those who are left behind with questions no one can answer. Why me? Why did the people I love have to leave like this?